All right, good morning to everybody who is on today. Welcome to our panel discussion session design webinar. I would like to introduce the people who will be speaking today. My name is Shira Babo. I'm a project associate at Training Resources Group, Inc. And we are supporting the Global Education Conference, particularly in this session design category. And I'm sitting here with one of my colleagues. I will let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. This is Darren Cambridge. I'm also with Training Resources Group and sit on the Session Design Committee for the Global Education Conference, so it's good to be with you all this morning.
And at some point, we will most likely be joined by Julene Heaney, who is our Event Management Coordinator for this conference. Before we get started, for those calling in, just a quick reminder to mute yourself to eliminate any background noise. And let's get into it. So just a reminder, right? Conference details, it's coming quickly. It'll be here on April 6th. Most of you will be presenting on April 6th or 7th, and the venue will be the Washington Hilton Hotel. That is near DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. There is a link on Education Links to register and book, or not to register, but to book your hotel room. We will come back to that at the end of this webinar. But before we get started, I do want to ask everyone a question, and that question is, have you ever participated in or moderated a panel? And if you are logged onto the app, please vote on the poll chat box. And if you're on the phone, you are welcome to put your answer into an email, and that email can be sent to gfu@usaid.gov. I'll give you about 5 more seconds. It looks like most of you have already answered on the poll, but just in case. It looks like everyone's been a panelist who's answered. That's interesting. All right. Thank you for answering that poll. I have one more question for you before we get started, and that is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how comfortable are you with designing a panel discussion? And again, you can answer in the box next to the chat, just to the left. And if you're on the phone, you can also send that answer to gfu@usaid.gov. And I'll give you about 10 more seconds to answer this second question. Well, it looks like most people are on the comfortable end of the spectrum, which is good. The reason that we are starting out with these questions is because this webinar is here to get you started. Oh, I see there's someone on the phone here. This webinar is here to get you started and get the creative juices flowing to think about how you're going to design your panel session. And so we wanted to gauge going into it where you were at in your thinking and comfortability, if that's a word, your comfort level with this particular format. So thank you for answering those. And we are going to move on. I'm going to let Darren take it away from here. Go for it.
Cool. Thanks, Shira. So as Shira just said, the goal of this webinar is to set you all up to be to successfully design and deliver a really informative and engaging panel discussion at the conference. And We're really emphasizing the pedagogy at this conference because we are education practitioners and we are in the education sector. And I think many of you have been to conferences and attended panel discussions that oftentimes they can look like just a series of back-to-back presentations that are somewhat connected, but it's not really a discussion. It's just back-to-back presentations. And then maybe there's some time at the end left for questions and answers, but usually there's not. And so I think with that in mind, that's what we want to avoid. We really want these panel discussions to be discussions and to have everyone who's part of that panel interacting not just with each other and the moderator, but also with the audience. So I'm going to share some techniques for how to engage the audience, how to organize and structure the discussion over 60 minutes, and then tips for developing good questions. But first, I just wanted to remind everyone of the 4 overarching tracks that are shaping the conference. And those are supporting a country's journey to self-reliance, coordination and collaboration, evidence-based decision-making, and system strengthening. So the conference will cover a number of different technical areas, and all of those technical areas will be explored through one of these 4 tracks. So as I said earlier, as the education sector, we're certainly going to show up with the important content, information, stories that can address these 4 tracks, but we also need to show up with the pedagogy that the research on education tells us actually generates learning results. So we learned just a couple of minutes ago at the start of the webinar that many of you have experience participating in or moderating a panel discussion or designing a panel discussion. So I would like everyone to please take a moment now and share one tip that you have from those experiences of creating a really great panel. And these can be tips that you would encourage people to do. They can also be tips that you would, things that you would discourage people from doing. So the kind of do's and don'ts of designing and facilitating a panel discussion is kind of what we're going for. So let's just take 20 seconds right now, and if you're in front of your computer, just type that tip into the chat window. And then we'll turn back to these tips that you've shared at the end, and we'll see how many of them match up with what I'm going to share, and then if there are any new tips that are revealed from you all in the audience.
So there's a couple good comments coming in, one from Cynthia, who says, keep presentations short to allow plenty of time for audience participation. I completely agree, Cynthia. And from Anthony, we have a do and a don't. So we have for our do, listen to the answers from panelists, build on their answers, and create the flow involving the audience at every stage possible. Awesome. And the don't from Anthony is don't be rigid, don't stick to a script, excuse me. And it looks like we have one from Julia Richards as well, who says, don't drag on. Find ways to keep your audience engaged and alert. So I'm seeing a lot on audience engagement in your comments. Awesome. And I see one last one here from Idalia, who says, have a pre-panel meeting or discussion with all the panelists so that everyone has a sense of the content presented by each. Awesome tips. All of these are actually going to come up later on, so you guys are nailing it.
Yeah, end of webinar. Thank you.
No. And 2 more here, one from Rebecca. Pose questions to the audience for them to discuss with those next to them. Generally, use questions that reinforce a panel message and allow practitioners to bring this into their context. Very good point. And from Christine, encourage panelists to speak with each other as opposed to just presenting. You guys are nailing this.
This is great. This is great.
Awesome.
All right. Well, this is good. We will touch on some of these, and we'll come back and revisit some of them in terms of what that looks like and how you encourage that type of facilitation or engagement. So I'm going to start by setting the stage for you all. The conference venue is set up in such a way that you all will have at least 75 people attending your panel discussion. And those 75 people will be seated theater style. So, you know, what you're looking at here is you've got a bunch of people just staring at you, waiting to learn something, to be engaged, participate. And so that's one of the challenges that come with panel discussions. So there are hundreds of ways to engage an audience that stimulate and support learning. The audience engagement techniques that I'm going to share with you are appropriate and designed specifically for the kind of large theater-style audience configuration that you all will be facing. So integrating these techniques into your session will increase audience attention and retention, going to Julia's point, and they're just going to make your session and the whole conference that much more enjoyable. We want people to end every session, every day, and the entire experience saying, wow, that was, you know, I actually feel like I have more energy than I did when I came in here, and I have clear takeaways from all the sessions I attended. And again, these techniques will help make that possible. So the best way for me to share these techniques is for me to put myself in your shoes. So I'm going to set up a scenario where I'm designing and moderating a panel discussion, and the title of my panel discussion is The Role of Bicycles in Addressing Climate Change. And so the following 5 techniques should take no more than 5 minutes to facilitate, and they'll help keep your audience focused, interested, and engaged. So the first technique is the simple show of hands, and this is a great technique to get a sense of the experience and needs of people in the audience, and then to use that to draw and shape the conversation and discussion itself. So if I wanted my panel discussion to talk about their perspective on long-distance cycling, I would use the show of hands technique in the following way. I'd ask the audience, I say, raise your hand if you have cycled more than 50 miles in a day. I'd wait for folks to raise their hand. I would then select 2 people at random in the audience, and I would invite them to share one thing they did to prepare for that ride. Again, I stress the word invite. We don't want to force anybody to do anything. But again, you just say, oh, I invite you to share one thing you did to prepare. I then briefly summarize what I heard, turn to the panelists, and ask them to react to the examples that we just heard from the audience, and then build off of those examples based on their own expertise. Another way that I could use this is I could ask people to raise their hand if you're thinking about doing a bicycle ride that is 50 miles or longer. Same deal, I would select 2 people at random, ideally folks in different parts of the room, maybe one person in the front, one person in the back. That helps everyone in the room realize that the discussion is not just focused on people who are sitting towards the front. And I'd invite those individuals to share one of the challenges they think they might face in preparing for doing that ride. I then turn to the panelists, ask them, hey, have you faced similar challenges or others in your experience, and how did you overcome those when you do long-distance cycling? So for your session, as you think about the topic that you and your panelists are going to explore, to use this technique, just think about a question or a prompt that will reveal audience experiences or needs, and that can spark the kind of conversation and discussion that you want the panelists to have. So a lot of you will be doing pre-work with the panelists, like what are the talking points, what are the main ideas, what are the stories that they want to share, how can you get something from the audience that leads the panelists into sharing that learning or that story. The agree-disagree technique involves audience members responding to a statement and then raising a red card if they disagree with the statement, or raising a green card if they agree with the statement. So you can also use this technique if you don't have any paper. You can have audience members hold up a fist if they disagree, or they can hold up an open palm if they agree. And this is a really good technique for gauging audience opinion. It's like an unofficial poll, and then prompting debate as a result of what the audience is showing you. So if I wanted the panel that I'm moderating to discuss, let's say, the growth and impact of electric assist bicycles, this is how I would use this technique. I would turn to the audience and I would say, all right, I'm going to read a statement. I want you to hold up a green card if you agree with the statement, and I want you to hold up a red card if you disagree with the statement. And the statement is, electric assist bicycles should not be allowed on bike paths. I'd wait for everyone to give their answer. I would then call on 1 to 2 people who disagree with the statement, and I'll call on 1 to 2 people who agree with that statement, and I invite them to share their opinion. Why did they answer the way that they did? After that, I'd turn to the panelists, summarize what I heard, and ask the panelists to react to those opinions and expand more broadly on the impact of electric assist bicycles. So for your session, thinking about your topic, technical area, to organize something around this technique, think about a statement or an opinion that's somewhat controversial or debatable that can highlight disagreements or contrasting perspectives on your session's topic. So all of that can be determined, again, ahead of time with your panelists saying, all right, what are some areas in the technical area or issues where we disagree and we have contrasting perspectives, and then design engagement with the audience around that. So round of applause technique involves asking people to show their enthusiasm or support for something by clapping. You've all probably seen this in some form or another. This is a great technique for allowing the audience to choose the path or direction of your session. It's also a bit more energizing than just having people raise their hands. That can get repetitive after a while. So let's say I wanted the audience in my session to decide how the panelists introduce themselves. I would show 3 questions on a slide or a piece of flip chart, and I'd read them out. I'd say, question 1, what's one of your fondest memories of riding a bicycle? Question 2, what's the longest bike ride you've ever done? Or 3, what's one dream bicycle ride that you really want to do before you die? And then I'll say, clap your hands if you want our panelists to answer question number 1. Give folks a couple seconds to applaud. Clap your hands if you want our panelists to answer question number 2. Clap your hands if you want the panelists to answer question number 3. And then, of course, whichever question receives the most applause is the one that the panelists will answer as part of their introduction. So this is, it's fun and it's exciting for folks to be able to guide the direction of the discussion. So for your session and this technique, think about all the questions that you would like the panelists to address, and then group them into categories. Then, if you like, have the audience decide which question from each category they want the panelists to discuss. So what this does is it allows you to ensure that all the categories that you want to discuss during the session are touched on, but it's the audience that gets to decide through which questions those categories are explored. Next is the fist to 5 technique. This one, maybe some of you haven't seen this, but it's great for introducing questions or prompts that can gauge opinions or skill levels that are a bit more nuanced than, oh, I agree, disagree, or yes, no. Not everything in life is that black and white. So this technique involves audience members responding to a prompt on a 0 to 5 scale using the fingers on their hands. So for my panel, I would use this technique in the following way. I would explain that one of the biggest challenges to becoming a consistent cyclist is knowing how to do your own basic bicycle maintenance, like changing a flat tire, replacing brake pads, cleaning and lubing your chain, etc. So on a scale from 0 to 5, using your fingers, tell us how capable you are of doing your own bicycle maintenance and repairs. So holding up a fist or 0 fingers means you have no idea whatsoever how to do anything with a bicycle. all the way up to holding up 5 fingers, which would mean you consider yourself an expert and you could build an entire bicycle from scratch. And so I ask everyone in the audience to, again, hold up any number from 0 all the way to 5 on your fingers, telling us how you would rate your skill level of basic bike maintenance. So people would do that. I'd scan the audience for the different hands and fingers in the air, and I'd note, oh, there are a lot of 0, 1, and 2 fingers being held up. I would turn to the panelists and say, it looks like it might be useful to hear from you all what you consider to be the most useful bike maintenance skills and how those skills have allowed you to remain a consistent cyclist, because, again, there are a lot of folks in the audience that want to up their skill level. And then finally, eliciting questions. So we've talked a lot about engaging the audience and helping them steer the conversation, but then how do you actually get questions from them? That's one of the most basic things we want from a panel discussion. So what we want to do, I'm going to start with what we want to avoid at all costs is leaving any questions to the very, very end of the panel. Because what we too often see happening, I'm sure you all have experienced, is that only 5 minutes remain for only 1 or 2 questions. And people can get really frustrated when that happens. So instead of transitioning, before you transition from one part of your discussion or a category of the discussion of topics to another, turn to the audience and take 2 to 3 questions at a time that are related to what the panelists just discussed. And then take all those questions at once and then turn to the panelists and have them address any or all of them. One of the challenges with taking one question at a time is there's no sense of urgency. So if one person stands up, they might go on a monologue, but if you say, hey, we're going to take 2 to 3 questions at a time, they know, all right, I'm going to keep my question quick because they want to get 2 other questions in here. So psychologically, it helps like people get to the point. And same with the panelists. If they take 1 question at a time, you could spend 10 minutes on 1 question. But if they know there's 2 others in the queue ready to go, your panelists will get to the point, respond, and then move on to the next one. So again, it helps with a sense of urgency to take 2 to 3 questions at a time. So what does a panel discussion look like when you organize the time, topics, and audience engagement over the course of 60 minutes? So here's a breakdown of how I ended up designing my panel discussion on the role of bicycling in addressing climate change. So you'll see how audience engagement kicks off each portion of the discussion. So starting at 0 minutes at the start, the introduction begins with the round of applause technique, and the audience is deciding how the panelists will introduce themselves, and that leads into a discussion of how each panelist developed a passion for cycling as a way to address climate change. So that's 5 to 10 minutes. We've already engaged the audience. They have some ownership over where the conversation is going, and we start with a nice lively introduction that's quick, and not just rehashing their, the speakers' bios that folks can get online. We then go back to the audience and we use the agree-disagree technique, posing to them the controversial issue of electric assist bicycles. This brought forward what was a known disagreement among the panelists, and it sparked debate among them. So this is something I decided ahead of time, that I knew that the panelists didn't agree on the role of electric assist bicycles, and this was going to spark that conversation. That leads into another controversial issue around expanding bike ridership, like bike lanes and bike path expansion. And then we steered the conversation to hear panelists give some examples of cities that they think have navigated those issues well. And then we say, all right, before moving on to our next topic, let's take 2 to 3 questions from the audience and hear how our panelists respond. Questions on electric assist bikes, bike lane expansion, and some things that cities have done. Then we shift the focus to issues around personal behavior change and forming a consistent cycling routine. So we use the fist to 5 technique to see how the audience members rated their own skills in doing routine bike maintenance. That's a huge indicator in determining whether or not someone sticks with a cycling routine. So then panelists, they react to the audience by sharing their own ideas on essential bike maintenance skills. That leads into other issues that shape consistent bike ridership, like how do you commute to work and how do you ride safely with other cars and traffic and vehicles. And then again, we pause. Before shifting to the next discussion topic, we turn to the audience. We say, let's take 2 to 3 questions from the audience related to behavior change and developing a consistent bike routine. And we'll hear all 3 questions and then turn back to our panelists to answer any or all of them. And then lastly, we use a show of hands technique to see how many people now find themselves a little bit more inspired to do more bike riding. A couple folks from the audience are invited to share what they heard and what has inspired them. And then we ask to see how many people now would consider taking on the challenge of a 50-plus mile bike ride. And then that opens up the panelists for a conversation on how to overcome those challenges, and then any concluding points or remarks, upcoming rides, again, kind of concluding statements. So this is an example or a sketch of how do you integrate audience engagement techniques, question and answer, how do you integrate that with all the topics and categories that you want your panelists to discuss. So this is a one way of structuring this and that you could share with the other panelists. So then when it comes to the role of the moderator and stimulating actual discussion, here are some tips for how to develop those questions. So first, as a moderator, think about questions that are cross-cutting across and that are cross-cutting patterns and themes in the work of all the panelists. So they need to be questions that all panelists can speak to. If you're answering questions that only one person can speak to, that starts leading into just one person monologuing, and it ceases to be a discussion. Think about questions that highlight similarities and differences in their approaches, context, projects, etc. We talked earlier about what's something that sparks debate. I mean, controversy, people like that. A lot of learning can come from when people hear differing perspectives as opposed to just everybody saying the same thing, but just in their own voice. Think about questions that are going to uncover how people in the audience can do their job better. We also want people to walk away from each session being like, that was totally relevant to the work that I do, and I'm going to be doing the second I leave this conference. So keep your audience in mind about what are the most relevant questions to them. Management and leadership. Again, there are a lot of people that go to these conferences for professional development. They want to hear experience and insights from people who are in positions that they seek to be in. So drawing out some of those stories and examples is going to be useful as well. And then think about questions that think about the future. Sure, we can talk about here's what we're doing now, here's what we did last month and last year, here's a recap of our project. But what does that mean now moving forward? I mean, what's the significance of this? Now that this has happened, we've had this experience, what are we going to do differently as a result of the things that we've learned? So structure questions that are going to lead to those types of contributions. And then when it comes for tips for the panelists themselves, we've shared a really great article for you. If you look at the bottom left-hand side of the screen under online resources, there's an article called Make Your Next Panel Discussion More Engaging.
Yeah, more compelling.
More compelling. So a lot of these tips are taken from that article. And so first, ask the panelists to come prepared with specific stories and examples. One way that panels can oftentimes go off the rails and become a little bit more boring is when you're hearing things that are more general or abstract, and it's not unique to the people that are sitting on the panel. You want to take advantage of the fact that you have that individual or that group of individuals uniquely sitting together for this set period of time. So utilize that time to get those stories and those examples from those individuals and not talk about something that folks could read in an article or in a book that you don't need a panel to learn those things. And then when they're thinking about their talking points and responding to some of these questions that you're going to tee up, a good way to structure your responses using a what, so what, now what structure. So what that means is you structure your response with, okay, what's the point that I'm making, and an example or a story that that illustrates that. So what? Why is that important that I shared this story? And then now what? What are the implications or applications for what you said? So I could share a story about a long bike ride that I did. I could say how it inspired me to continue to do more bike riding and make me less fearful, and so I've become a more consistent bike rider. And now that means that the steps I've taken are figuring out different routes that I can take to keep my commute to work more exciting. So changes that I'm making in the future. I can say all that in 30 seconds or less, and then turn it to somebody else in the discussion who can build off of that, respond to that, connect to that. But that's another comment that someone made earlier around building on answers. I think it was Anthony that, listen to answers from the other panelists. That's what you're responding to just as much as you are from the questions from the moderator or from the audience. And then build on those answers, just like you're sitting around a table with a cup of coffee with other colleagues. So to review, tailor your content, ask yourself what drives your audience, what insights and tools will be useful for them. Use inclusive language as a moderator or as a panelist. Start your responses or your questions with, oh, like many of you in the audience, or who among us has, et cetera, et cetera. We all have the experience of ... That's going to keep people connected and to the discussion. Also, poll the audience. Use these techniques. Demonstrate how you want them to respond. Ask a question. Comment on a response. Model the behavior that you want them to see. Then when it comes to practicing, work with your panelists. Sketch out a general run of show and the timing and how much time you're going to dedicate to each of the discussion topics or categories. Structure your talking points. Use the stories and examples, the what, now what, so what. And then, again, build in audience engagement. Really make that a key part of how you design this panel discussion. So with that, we'll stop there. Oh, yes, we have a couple more slides. Sorry. Last slide deals with the type of support that TRG is able and willing to provide for you all if you like. So the first level of support is facilitation or moderation support. So that means that we have professional facilitators and moderators that you can utilize if you don't have one yourself or you don't want to take on that role in your panel. That means that you're going to have someone who's solely dedicated to making sure that your session starts on time and it ends on time. They can do that in a very delicate, eloquent and professional way. That can be very difficult sometimes. This person will ensure that the session flows smoothly, that you're weaving in and out of engagement with the audience, back to the moderator, our moderation, in with the panelists, encouraging equitable participation across the different panelists and that no one person is talking too much. So they can provide that type of support. And then they can do those things that we talked about. They can facilitate that audience engagement technique. They can pose the questions to the panelists, keep the conversation moving, all those types of things. That's a difficult task for those of you who have moderated panels before, particularly if you're also a subject matter expert who wants to engage in the conversation and not necessarily moderate it. So we do want to put that out there and say, this is an option for you all. Just let us know, yes, I want facilitation or moderation support, and we will assign someone who has experience working in the education sector. So it's not someone who's completely oblivious to your technical expertise. They know enough to be able to effectively moderate and facilitate that type of session.
And with that, we will open it up to your questions. So go ahead if you have questions or comments. Please feel free to type those in the chat box. If you are on the phone, I do want to point out that we do have some online links and downloadable resources, including this PowerPoint, that will be made available to you after this session is finished, hopefully either later today or potentially tomorrow. We will also have a recording of this webinar to post if you would also like to see the presentation and get involved and see what the chat said as well. So if there are any questions from those who are online, now is the time. We will give you a little bit of time to type those in. I also do want to say that Julene Heaney, our event management coordinator, has joined us on the line. Julene, if you want to say hello to everybody, now is the perfect time.
Hi, everyone. Good morning.
Thanks, Julene. It looks like we have one person typing, so I will wait for them to get their question or comment in. All right, so it looks like it's a pretty quiet crowd this morning, so we will give you some more time to sit on that. While you are thinking and cooking up any questions or comments, I do want to remind everyone of some upcoming deadlines, some of which are coming up quite quickly. So February 9th is the final day for you and your co-presenters to register for the conference. After that, we cannot guarantee that you will have a space. So please do that. That is coming up very quickly. End of this month, February 24th, is the final day for you and your co-presenters to book hotel rooms. There is a link available for that has been sent out. February 28th is a big date for anyone who is presenting. That is the date that we ask that your final session title and final session description be added to the form that you have been working off of since last week. It was a form that was sent out by Julene, and it told you about this webinar and the next steps in this process. February 28th is also, if you are going to have any slides, we don't recommend you do for panel discussions, but if you feel that you really must, we do ask that you have a preliminary version of that uploaded to that same platform where you'll be adding the final session title and description. And from there, you will have until March 20th to finalize, if applicable, any PowerPoint presentations. So it looks like there are some questions coming in. I'm going to go back here and grab a couple of those. One from LH who asks, are we responsible for recruiting our own panelists or are we being connected to them? At this point in the process, you should know who's on your panel. You should have submitted a proposal. If you did not have co-presenters listed on that proposal and you were accepted as is, then yeah, you do need to get those people signed up as of February 9th, which is in 3 days. So please do that. Darren, I don't know if you want to add anything else. Julene, I don't know if you all want to chime in.
No, I think that's great. I think you're best suited. Yeah, go ahead, Julene.
Oh, I was going to mention that in your notification email, you will know who is on your panel because they're listed there. It has the names of the lead presenters on any panel, any proposals you've been merged with, along with the names of the co-presenters that were listed on each of those proposals. So if you have any doubt about that, go back to those notification emails that you received on January 15th.
Thanks, Julian, for adding that. That is a great point. Miriam has a couple of questions here. Were determinations of what government officials will be invited already communicated? I'm going to kick that to Julene. If yes, does it mean that if we have not received a response regarding a government official, that they are not invited? So, Julene, you're best placed to talk about government official invites here.
If there's a government official that you think is interested in attending the conference, they should request an invitation to attend via the registration page. It's the first big button that's on that registration page. It says request an invitation to attend. If you misplace that email that includes that link, just let us know and we will send that to you again after this webinar.
Awesome. Thank you, Julene. From Julia Richards, will participants at the conference be free to walk in and out of panels or other sessions, or will the doors be closed after the session starts? Excellent question.
That's a very good question. You've been to many conferences, haven't you?
That's a great question. I'm not sure of the answer. I believe doors.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Julie.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you have an answer.
Yes. So the doors will close once the session starts. We do expect that our breakout rooms will be at capacity. So we do plan on closing those doors after. That's the current plan.
Great, thank you. From Cynthia, who is on the line here, the techniques presented are very interesting and helpful. They seem to recommend that panelists not do any kind of presentation or spend time talking about their experience up front, but rather the session be entirely topic-driven. Am I understanding it correctly?
Yes, absolutely. There are several different formats that folks were invited to utilize when they submitted proposals. And we did a webinar yesterday on Ignite Talks, and that was a format where people have, you know, a scripted presentation. There was a amount of time allotted, and you know, 3 to 4 people in any given session kind of give that presentation, and then there's engagement. But that's more of the presentation format. We want the panel discussions to be discussions. And so that means that it's not one presentation followed by another presentation where panelists aren't talking to each other. That's a different format. And so we want this to feel very different from those other sessions. And then also, I like how you talked about like talking up front about their experience. We want them to talk about their experience. We just want to do it around a unified question that can bring all the panelists together and that it's not disjointed. I also want people to steer away from, or we want people to steer away from having long biographical introductions for each panelist. There are some panels that have, you know, 4 or 5 people on them. If each panel gets, you know, a 2-minute introduction of like, here's where they work, here's where they worked before, here's awards that they've won, you know, all of a sudden there's 10 minutes swallowed up and no discussion has been had whatsoever. And that's all information that people can learn on their own from a bio online. So we want to prevent sharing information in the physical space that people can get just as easily or more easily online reading the person's bio. So we don't want to spend too much time on just kind of biographical introductions.
Great. And last but not least, Anthony Siciliano asked, can you post the link for registration? You did receive that link once you accepted your invitation to present. You should have that in an email. It should have also been sent out in a reminder. I do not have the link at the moment, but we are able to send that to you if you need it. Julene?
Yes, and when we do send the link to the recording of today's webinar, which will go out to all of you, the registration link will again be included there as well.
Great. Thank you, Julene. I see one more person typing, so I will give that person a couple people time to get their thoughts down. No problem, Anthony. And LH has a follow-up question here. From the original January 15th email, it also says we should expect a follow-up email with guidelines for our session format. Has that been issued? Yes, it has. This is part of that email.
Yes. So the webinar, the access to the webinar is part of that follow-up. We will also send a reminder with other details such as the times that your session will start, when you should be in the room. If you, Darren has mentioned that we discourage slides, but if you will have them, what the ratio parameters of those are. So there will be yet another email giving you those details.
One thing I'll add too, in terms of follow-up guidelines for session format, there is the panel discussion session format toolkit that was included in the call for proposals. It's also linked here and under downloadable resources. If you look towards the bottom of your screen, there's that toolkit there. And I encourage people to go and check that out if you haven't, or recheck it, because there is an example. We have, I think, one or two video examples of panel discussions that model what we're looking for this conference. So when we talked about no long introductions for panelists, keeping it actually discussion focused, how the moderator engages the audience, there's some examples there that you can that can further elucidate the points that we're trying to make. So definitely check that out.
Great, and it looks like the typing has died down a little, and please feel free to keep on posting questions if you have them as they come up. But I do want to ask of one more thing of those who are online. In the chat box, just let us know one thing you're going to take away from the last 45 minutes. What will you walk away with as you head into the design of your panel discussion? I'll give you a few seconds here to type that up.
And yeah, definitely put your comments in here in this chat box, because what you all are taking away is just as important, if not more important, than what we presented. So don't be shy. If you have your computer open, type just one takeaway. And again, it can be something that was shared here. It can be something that was shared in the tips that were provided earlier from other participants, or it can be something totally new that we didn't mention. But we want to make sure that your takeaways are captured and shared with everybody on the webinar and everyone who's going to receive a recording of this later.
I see some good ones in that chat box. Give you about 10 more seconds, then we will wrap things up a little, bringing it in.
So yeah,
Awesome.
so for folks on the phone,
Go ahead.
Anthony writes, let the audience lead as much as possible. Miriam writes, focus on substance and what is new and different, not too much talk. Miriam writes, Miriam also writes, keep it short and sweet. Yes, exclamation point on that. Rebecca writes, very focused and interactive. Make sure that the discussion is focused and interactive. Cynthia writes, draw out experiences rather than feeding them. Lead the horses to water. And then Julia Richards writes, not a series of papers. Yes.
All
yes.
fantastic.
All good.
So, final question to you all. On a scale of 1 to 5, after spending a lovely 45 minutes with us here at TRG, how comfortable are you with designing your panel discussion? I will leave you with that. Please answer in the middle box where it says final participant poll. And with that, I will let you have a wonderful morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Julene, for answering some of those questions, and we are excited to see what you come up with in the weeks to come.
See you in April.